We are in the Way of God. We did the introduction last week, and now we are in chapter 1. And if you'll remember, in the outline of the whole book, The Way of God, the first chapter is the fundamental principles of reality. The fundamental principles of reality. We're going to probably only be able to get through the first section or paragraph of the first chapter, and it is about the Creator, about Hashem. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto offers that there are a number of things about God each one of us needs to know and believe. He apparently combines two because Rambam Maimonides said in one context that we are to know certain fundamentals of faith, including the facts of God's existence. That's number one. And in another, he said that we are to believe them. It appears that the Ramchal contends that we need to do both at the same time. So the idea is not just to have an intellectual assent, to believe, or yes, I believe that God exists. Even more, but it's also to believe. That's why it said that a person and the people in the nations, and this comes from the sages of blessed memory, said the people of the nations, as long as they're not idolatrous, don't necessarily have to know God. They did believe God. They can say, "Oh God, I know that there's a God," or people have said that there's a God, but not necessarily believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and still have a place in the world to come if they live a righteous life, if they're just, if they don't murder, they don't steal, they still can have a place in the world to come because they're not rasha or evil, right? In this case, though we understand that for the people of the nations, if they're to be considered a b'nai Noach or a ger, righteous among the nations, not only do they have to know that there's a God, but they have to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because one of the fundamental things that we learn about Torah, simply knowing the Torah does not do anything. Believing means that you actually are engaged in doing it. You do what you believe, correct? There are a lot of people that say, I know that there's a God, or I know God, but they'll tend to say, I believe in God. But it's actually the opposite. A person acknowledges that there's a God, but don't believe it because they don't do anything about it. Does that make sense? So the Ramchal says that it's important that we do both at the same time. This is one of the fundamental principles of reality when it comes to the Creator. So much for a more academic answer according to the translation of this text here. He says, the question of why both knowing and believing is listed. We like to approach it differently now and ask a couple of questions based on the combination. First, what's the difference between believing and knowing, and why, for our purpose, did the Ramchal combine them? The best way to define the difference between knowing and believing is to imagine being without either one. It seems that not believing is more personally and existentially threatening and more darkly dire than not knowing, because I am convinced that if I don't know something, I can always learn it. While if I don't believe it, I am left somehow stranded. And in fact, many of our sages have taught that belief is higher than knowledge. Not knowing threatens also not knowing. For example, why something bad happened to me seems to dampen the pain and lead solace, while not knowing seems to gnaw at my being and oppress me. As we mentioned in the last class, you can see already how complex some of these ideas are. Can you imagine having to translate the Ramchal's work? So let's analyze these. Well, let's first read this next paragraph and then we'll analyze it. Apparently, the Ramchal's point is that there is somehow or another so internalized the truth of God's existence, so convince ourselves of his living presence, that both the dark, dread lack of faith in him and the bleak, dulling lack of knowledge of God always in the world simply disappear. So, let's take for a second, examine this idea of knowing and believing, and how does that affect our walk with Hashem. Why is it a fundamental principle? Why must we know and believe at the same time? Because simply knowing doesn't really achieve anything. Believing means that we are actually committed to the idea. And it's not just believing as in an empty faith, because many people think that belief is faith, believing in something that you don't know or you can't prove. This is not what they're talking about. This kind of belief is, I believe because I know, and I believe God because of what I know. Follow. I believe God because of what I know. Because I know Torah, because I've developed these paradigms of understanding of the Torah, because I know them, I believe Him. Next. But how do we ever do this? How do we accomplish this duality? This may help. Notice how Ramchal titled his work, The Way of God, in the singular rather than the ways. It seems he put it in a singular because a major point is throughout his writing is that all in all, God has one broad way or agenda, if you will, with many narrow paths or agendas along the way leading up to it. He intends to allow the universe to reach perfection in the end. So why does he say the way singular, the way of God? Is we understand that there is one way, and it is God's purpose. We talked about this last night in the class, that we look at Joseph and all the twists and turns that his life took throughout the years prior to his brothers coming back into the scene and they're having their relationship restored. With all the dips and turns and difficulties he had, he maintained a course, and the course was to be a servant of Hashem. And in being a servant of Hashem, he was able to develop out a singular approach to his life, even though he had many different paths he went down during that time. Does that make sense? Even though at one time he was kidnapped, the other time he was a slave, another time accused of a crime and in prison, and that time he's a viceroy. At all times he maintained this singular direction. Yes, ma'am.
It's kind of like we've talked in the past about when the Israelites are in the wilderness. It's sometimes called journey, but also the journeys. Journeys,
exactly. Even though they were on a long journey, it was called the journeys.
Each had their...
Very, very good point. So we can clearly understand that that the Ramchal is pointing to the fact that if you develop out this idea fully, and you fully grasp the idea that even though there is a way, the way of God, that way involves many complex paths. Are you grasping that? I know sometimes it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around that, but the idea is our life is this way, and as soon as we can grasp that and realize the Creator that's who He is and how He works in our life, then clearly we can begin to operate with a little bit more assurity that God knows what He's doing.
Singularity of purpose.
That's very good. I like that. Singularity of purpose. That's really good. Learning this, the gift of this book of God's ultimate agenda in light of His many side agendas. That having been said, that what are we to believe and know about Him after all? The first thing is that the first being, and that he exists before anything and everyone else, and will continue to exist after everything and everyone is gone. So we talk about the oneness of God. And we clearly know and understand that when we speak of the oneness of Hashem, we're not talking about a number one. We're talking about the fact that nothing exists outside of Hashem. That he is in himself, all self-sustaining, nothing can contribute, nothing can take away from him, and that he is one. Now, he says, if he's the first being, of course he exists before anything and anyone else. What's Ramchal's point? He says, what's the difference? Perhaps we can explain God's being termed the first being this way. We are to somehow or another appear out of nowhere and come upon reality for the first time. The first being we'd notice the most obvious, preeminent being would be God, simply because we haven't yet had a chance to take his presence for granted and hadn't yet been waylaid by all the other things that have us overlook him. Every person in the world, and they talk about this in science, that everybody, what is it called, the pineal gland in the back of the brain is like the God, it's called the God, the God center or something like that, that every human being has this, and that is where you sort of perceive divineness, right? It's like it's all been plugged into you. And it's a pretty interesting concept that science recognizes that there's some, that gland in your brain has something to do with your connection to divineness or spirituality. And it's really interesting. Which goes to prove that even without the knowing God, or having a knowledge of God, everybody has this desire to connect to God and to spirituality. It's really interesting. It says God will eventually prove to have existed before everything else too, but knowing that would come later, after we have understood the alarm and stun of catching sight of his presence in the first place. Again, we're also told that we will continue to exist, he will continue to exist after everything is gone. Why would we need to know that? Why would we need to know that God exists after we're all gone? What do you think? Very important. Can you?
If he didn't, he would be no different than
anybody else.
Anybody else.
Sets him apart.
Sets him apart, and there's no oneness there, right? Oneness being that if he ceased to exist after we're gone, then God's merely a figment of our imagination or a creation of our imagination, and he's not. There's also this idea that when it says that when we're gone, we're not talking about eternal insecurity. We're talking about an eternal security, knowing that the Creator is in charge even after we're gone. Sometimes we, as parents, worry about our children, right? We think about our children, grandchildren. I hope that they're going to be successful and they have good health, etc. But when you become a true follower of Hashem and you not only know but believe Hashem, you realize that he's actually in charge and those souls belong to him and that he'll take care of them. He has a plan and he'll take care of them. And I know it's harder for the mothers than I think the fathers. Moms tend to worry about their babies, and they're always your babies even when they're 30 or 40 years old, right? But you always worry about your babies. But there is a security to know that Hashem's in charge, and long after you're gone and in the grave, he's going to manage them very well. He knows what he's doing. And that is a big part of our faith. It seems the best way to illustrate and explain God's preceding and succeeding everything and everyone, the Ramchal points out, imagine a grand concert hall full of rolling thunders and pitches and low pitches and gravitas and piccato, all the sounds of the orchestra. And imagine it beginning with a single bold note that somehow or another leads threads in concert and appears again at the end of the concert. Wouldn't that single note prove to have defined the concert in retrospect and to have given it its heft or its meaning? That's exactly what the Ramchal's point is. God's ineffable presence defines reality and gives it its heft. And that by being the first and the last, he is the better part of the whole. If God is the first and the last, he's the better part of the whole. Meaning, if God existed before time, he would exist after time because he's the eternal, right? Then that defines who God is. And how do we know that there is a God? Because we see him in the proof of the physicality and the now. Right? We see him in the now. It's interesting. His final point here is that God and God alone both created and maintains everything. Simply put, that comes to deny the power of anything or anyone else to truly, utterly create out of the blue. And it comes to underscore the fact that God not only created us, he also maintains our beings moment by moment. I had an experience with a very good friend of mine back when I was 20 years old, 25, yeah, about 25. He was a avowed agnostic. And he wasn't sure if he was an atheist or agnostic. He said, I think I'm an agnostic more. Like, there might be a God, but not really sure. There's no real proof. He was a real heady guy, science, he believed in science. And, one night we were out in the desert and looking up at the stars. And if you've ever been out to where there's no city lights around, it's almost like the stars will smother you, right? It's amazing. And you could see the Milky Way. I just covered the sky. And he started saying, see this constellation here? And he was explaining how far away it was. And some really interesting facts, right? And if you were able to travel, it's so many light years and how many man years, and he's just going on and on and on. And we're just looking at it. And I was pretty enthralled by his knowledge of the constellations. And I said, wow. He said, isn't that amazing? I said, yes. And to think that there couldn't be a God. And it's a long pause, and he goes, very good point. Right? I mean, that's exactly it. That's where you feel God is. You feel more, to me, I feel more connected to Hashem when I'm in creation and nature. Go to the mountains. Go stand on top of Pikes Peak in Colorado. You look, and they say, look, you can see, 4 states from this place or 3 different states on this continent. And you think, wow, this is almost a God view, right? And you just say, look at all of this and tell me that this randomly appeared in the universe. When people say, well, the universe is only 6,000 years, and others saying it's 64 billion to trillion years, it's immaterial. The fact that it exists shows me and gives me the knowledge of God. And for a person to deny the beauty of physicality and is to completely ignore that there is something behind that or something before and after that, right? That creation itself, and I love that final statement, this statement that says that if God is the beginning and God is after us, meaning he continues on, then he feels all of that we are in. He is permanently here and now. Meaning that my great-great-grandchildren, God willing, if redemption doesn't speed along too quick, my great-great-great-grandchildren will have no relationship, won't know me. They might have a few pictures, some video, but they can have the same kind of viable relationship with the Creator as I have. Just as real, just as poignant and powerful, and that's amazing. So the Ramchal wraps this this paragraph up by saying, returning to the musical analogy, we add that God not only presses his lips, if you will, to the mouth of our beings to start playing us or to animate us, he continues to throughout the concert. I love that phrase. So as he breathed life into Adam, he also continued to sustain Adam throughout his life. And this is one of the reasons why that we discover the power of prayer, hitbadadu. Personal prayer is so important, because it is through that expression of our lips are we having the Creator continue to breathe within us life. It's an amazing thing. That concludes this first section, which is actually the first paragraph. Tomorrow, next Thursday, we will start on the second paragraph of the text, dealing with this subject matter, the fundamental principles of reality, the Creator. Anybody have any comments, questions? Yes?